Hey, Jerry here with CannIntel 420. And as usual, this discussion is educational and informational in nature and does not promote consumption, sale, or cultivation where it is restricted. Everything here is framed for professional analysis, regulatory-aware context, and applied industry understanding. Operators, patients, consumers, and regulators each exist inside different legal environments, and nothing in this program replaces the need to follow the rules where you live. With that said, let's talk honestly about flavor, chemistry, and what happens when an industry chases the same profile until the plant stops speaking back. There is a running joke in cultivation circles that modern flower smells like a pastry case with a light fuel garnish. The sort of satire that lands because it is uncomfortably accurate. The humor isn't cruel, it is diagnostic. When every jar opens to the same sweet cream, candy rind, and softened gas top note, you are not looking at diversity, you are looking at selection pressure. The market demanded a specific sensory lane, and breeding programs obliged, compressing entire branches of chemotypic expression into a narrow band of familiar, dessert-leaning outputs. The irony is that people talk about these profiles like they are endless variety, when in reality they are often different phenotypic presentations orbiting the same underlying chemical neighborhood. The reason everything begins to taste the same is not mysticism, branding, or nostalgia. It is convergent chemistry produced by convergent genetics. Breeding toward repeatable market winners rewarded line crossing inside a closed loop of parents carrying similar aromatic drivers. Over time, this reduces the expression space available to the crop. Instead of wide phylogenetic distance across lineage, operators receive subtle variations on a theme. The top of the profile still presents sugar-leaning floral tones and confectionary fruit notes, even when the structure, resin behavior, or morphology hint at a deeper heritage underneath. What once signaled lineage can become cosmetic, because the chemistry is being stabilized towards sameness rather than exploration. This is not theory. It shows up in rooms, in dry rooms, in cure, and at the counter. When the bulk of an inventory pulls from closely related breeding pools, the ratios of dominant volatiles and supporting aroma contributors begin to overlap. That overlap is where the sensory flattening occurs. The result is product that feels familiar before the customer even learns its name. To the operator, it looks like consistency. To the plant, it is constraint. And to the trained nose, it reveals a narrowing ecosystem dressed up as variety. There is a real cost to this. It is not only cultural or aesthetic. It is agronomic, economic, and scientific. Genetic redundancy limits resilience and narrows stress response diversity, which changes how crops behave under environmental variability, pathogen pressure, and post-harvest handling. It also conditions both producers and consumers to treat a very small slice of the plant's chemical potential as the default standard, which then feeds back into selection and reinforces the loop. The industry celebrates victory while slowly erasing the signals that once made cultivars distinct. The satire writes itself because it sounds like a dessert menu, and at this point, the joke is more observational than clever. But beneath the humor sits a serious reality. When every flower smells like a bakery that once hosted a mechanic, it is not because the plant lacks range. It is because range has been bred out of circulation in favor of predictability. The story we tell here is not about nostalgia for an imagined past. It is about understanding how breeding decisions, parent selection, clonal propagation, and marketplace reward structures shape the chemical landscape that reaches the jar. This conversation begins by acknowledging that sameness is not accidental. It is engineered, and if we want to understand why everything tastes the same, we have to interrogate how we arrived at a place where dessert genetics became the gravitational center of an entire market and what that means for operators who care about authenticity, chemistry, and long-term integrity in the plant. From here, the reason this flavor compression accelerated is that the modern supply chain rewards genetic predictability over biological range. Breeding houses and nurseries do not simply chase novelty, they chase traits that clear shelves and pass through procurement with minimal friction. When a profile becomes associated with reliable turns at retail, it stops being a trend and becomes a risk reduction tool. Operators who are exposed to crop loss, price compression, and volatile wholesale markets begin selecting not for expression, but for survivability in a commercial environment. Dessert-forward parents rise to the top of breeding pools because they create flowers that buyers recognize, that COAs present cleanly, and that marketing can package without explanation. Inside real phenotype programs, this shows up as an immediate bias during selection. Plants that express bright confectionary fruit, soft cream, candy rind, or pastry-leaning aromatics are advanced because they align with what purchasing staff already knows how to sell. Plants that present deep resin funk, feral herbal volatility, sharp phenolic edge, or mineral-leaning terpene structures are often cut early, not because they lack value, but because they require education, patience, and a market willing to be challenged. The irony is that the latter category often carries greater lineage, integrity, and broader stress response diversity, but those traits do not translate into short-cycle revenue as easily as a familiar jar note that buyers can identify in a single breath. There is also a financial barrier that keeps this knowledge out of public view. The cost of large-scale phenotype hunts, tissue culture stabilization, clonal indexing, and longitudinal crop performance evaluation is carried by operators and breeders, not by the consumer. The lessons learned in those rooms live behind contracts, non-disclosure, or private data sets. So, the public hears marketing language about exotic genetics and dessert waves, while the people actually running the selections understand that what is being chased is repeatable chemistry that keeps a production schedule safe. None of this is hidden because of conspiracy. It is hidden because the only people who see the full picture are the ones paying for the work. Testing culture reinforces the same gravity well. Over time, lab reporting became less about understanding the breadth of a plant's volatile profile and more about validating a narrow set of expectations that buyers already had. When a familiar dessert-leaning profile pairs with visually dense resin and strong bag presence, the product is pre-validated before anyone even interprets the underlying chemistry. That loop trains producers to anchor their work inside the same genetic corridors again and again. It is not that other chemotypes disappear, they are simply never advanced into production because they introduce uncertainty in a system that penalizes deviation. At the retail level, this homogenization feels like success. Jars move, customers feel comfortable, brand portfolios appear consistent, but at the cultivation level, it means operators are repeatedly cycling the same parentage across rooms, season after season, which constrains the adaptive capacity of the crop. You see it in how certain rooms respond to stress, how pathogens exploit uniformity, and how post-harvest outcomes begin to converge regardless of cultivar label. The sameness of flavor is not just sensory, it is structural. This is how an industry ends up celebrating a narrow slice of chemistry as if it were the full spectrum of what the plant can do. Not because people lacked imagination, but because every pressure point in the system, breeding, procurement, testing, marketing, inventory risk rewarded one outcome above all others. And once that outcome became the safest place to stand, dessert genetics stopped being a style and became an infrastructure. Now, the counter-movement inside the industry is not nostalgic and it is not romantic. It is technical. The operators pursuing recovery of lost chemotypes are not trying to relive a past era. They are attempting to reintroduce genetic range using tools that did not exist when those lines were first circulating. This effort is grounded in archival clone preservation, landrace reintroduction, structured backcrossing, tissue culture sanitation, genomic screening, and controlled phenotypic validation under repeatable environmental conditions. The goal is not to recreate old flour as it once was. The goal is to reconstruct the chemical breadth that was bred out of circulation and stabilize it with modern agronomic discipline. These programs tend to originate with breeders and growers who maintain private libraries across years of consolidation. Some of those libraries include unworked parental stock, early hybrid material that predates the dessert convergence, and regional selections that carried distinct volatile signatures before commercial selection pressure began compressing everything into the same band. Those collections are now being revisited with improved instrumentation, deeper crop analytics, and tissue culture pipelines that allow for pathogen-free regeneration and long-term preservation. Instead of guessing at what a line can do, operators can track resin behavior, stress response, stomatal sensitivity, and post-harvest stability across controlled runs, which allows them to refine expression rather than dilute it. Modern genomics is a major difference here. Breeders rebuilding lost chemotypes are not relying on memory, aroma descriptors, or cultural myth. They are using marker-informed selection to avoid collapsing back into the same homogenized corridors that the broader market rewards. Lines are stress-tested, not only for yield and visual density, but for their ability to hold distinct chemical architecture across environments. If a plant only expresses its identity in one very specific set of conditions, it is treated as fragile rather than special. The intent is to create cultivars with recognizable depth that survive real-world production without defaulting to the same confectionary profile the market has normalized. There is also a quiet shift in how these operators define success. Instead of selecting for immediate retail familiarity, they are selecting for structural resilience, terpene balance outside dessert-dominant clusters, and secondary volatile contributors that give a profile contour rather than sweetness. Some of these revived or reconstructed lines read as sharper, more herbal, more fermented, more mineral-leaning, or more resin-forward in a way that feels foreign to customers who have only known modern candy-leaning flour. That unfamiliarity is intentional. It signals that the plant is operating in a different chemical space, supported by lineage that was preserved rather than continuously diluted. Where earlier eras lacked the infrastructure to stabilize these expressions, contemporary operators can pair archival genetics with climate-controlled cultivation, precise fertigation regimes, normalized VPD strategies, and disciplined dry and cure programs that protect volatile fractions rather than sanding them down. What was previously dismissed as inconsistent or funky can now be cultivated with enough environmental discipline to reveal its intended profile, rather than its stress artifact. The chemistry becomes legible once the production noise is removed. This reconstruction effort is not loud because it is not designed for hype cycles. It exists in breeder rooms, in private R&D blocks, in small run releases that test whether the market is ready to accept profiles that do not conform to dessert expectations. When those lots succeed, they prove that sameness was never a consumer demand problem. It was a supply-side comfort mechanism. The work underway now shows that with modern tools, preserved lineage, and disciplined selection, it is possible to bring back range without sacrificing reliability, not by imitating the past, but by rebuilding what was lost with more control than the industry ever had when those profiles first existed. There is also a measurable and deliberate push towards sulfur-forward genetics, not as a novelty trend, but as a corrective response to the narrowing of terpene-dominant dessert chemistry. This movement is grounded in analytic chemistry, in breeding programs that intentionally reintroduce lines capable of producing volatile sulfur compounds, and in real cultivation outcomes where these expressions are being stabilized rather than treated as accidents or defects. The people driving this work are doing it because they understand that sulfur-based aroma contributors are part of the historical chemical landscape of cannabis, and their disappearance was a byproduct of market bias, not biological inevitability. In the last several years, analytical labs working with research-grade extraction and mass spectrometry platforms have confirmed that some of the most distinctive skunk, garlic, onion, savory fermented, and rubber resin signatures do not originate primarily from monoterpene or sesquiterpene dominance. They are driven by low-concentration, high-impact sulfur-containing volatiles that present at trace levels, but exert disproportionate influence on perceived aroma. Operators working in R&D blocks have been seeing this reality in rooms long before it reached academic publication. When certain older hybrid lines, chem heritage lines, or gas-leaning cuts were grown with a disciplined environment and careful post-harvest handling, the resulting profile carried a deep skunky edge that could not be explained by terpene ratios alone. That observation was later reinforced by analytical confirmation rather than replaced by it. Breeders pursuing this direction are not guessing. They are selecting parents and progeny that repeatedly demonstrate sulfur-driven nose across multiple environments and runs, while also showing agronomic stability. These programs maintain mother stock in tissue culture to keep pathogen load from confounding the chemistry, and they validate expression across different fertigation intensities, light densities, and substrate regimes to ensure that the sulfur expression is genetically anchored rather than stress-induced. When a phenotype only presents sulfur notes under environmental duress, it is discarded. When it carries a consistent, savory skunk signature under controlled conditions, it is advanced, backcrossed, and indexed to preserve that chemical identity. This resurging interest is especially visible in cuts that descend from gas-heavy American hybrid families, chemline material, and some garlic-leaning and fuel-leaning programs that were previously marginalized because they were considered too aggressive or too challenging for dessert-conditioned retail buyers. Under modern controlled drying, extended equilibration, and oxygen-aware curing protocols, those same lines reveal layered sulfur-forward profiles that feel closer to the historical description of skunk or roadkill expressions than anything found in confectionary parents. The important operational fact is that these expressions are not being accidentally rediscovered. They are being deliberately recovered and stabilized by people with the resources to do the work correctly. The scientific relevance here is practical, not abstract. Sulfur-based volatiles occupy a different sensory lane than sweet-leaning terpene clusters. They create sharp, resin-dense, savory, animalic, and fermented edges that give structure and contrast to a profile instead of flattening it into sweetness. From a cultivation perspective, plants that reliably produce these compounds also tend to correlate with resin behavior and flower architecture that align with earlier hybrid performance characteristics, including thicker cuticle development and distinct drying behavior that must be respected in post-harvest to avoid washing out the volatile fraction. When these lines are handled with generic dessert profile curing practices, the sulfur character collapses. When they are handled with intention, the chemistry remains intact and unmistakable. There's also a market-side truth that rarely gets discussed publicly. Wholesale buyers are beginning to recognize that sulfur-driven lots move differently with experienced consumers who are fatigued by sameness. These buyers are not chasing nostalgia. They are looking for category differentiation grounded in chemistry, not branding. As a result, breeders advancing sulfur-forward work finally have a commercial on-ramp that did not exist during the height of dessert-dominant consolidation. The demand is still selective, but it is real, and it is based on measurable sensory distinctiveness rather than hype vocabulary. The resurgence of sulfur-based genetics is not an internet myth, and it is not romantic storytelling about the past. It is a technically informed counter-selection effort rooted in real lineage, analytic confirmation, disciplined environmental control, and production-validated phenotype stability. It exists because experienced operators recognize that a living crop loses resilience and identity when one narrow flavor economy defines its genetics, and they are now using every tool available to rebuild the range that was pushed aside, including the sulfur-forward expressions that once defined some of the most unmistakable cannabis profiles ever grown. Now circling back, the reason dessert-leaning genetics continue to dominate commercial production, even as sulfur-forward and chemically diverse programs re-emerge, comes down to structural incentives across the supply chain that favor predictable, visually marketable, low-friction product over chemically distinctive cultivars that require consumer education and tighter post-harvest handling. This persistence is not cultural inertia or taste preference alone. It is reinforced by procurement behavior, production economics, phenotype replacement risk, retailer conditioning, and the interaction between visual grading standards and COA-driven sales frameworks. Dessert profile plants remain favored in large-scale and mid-market operations because they generally align with architecture that is easier to standardize. These lines tend to express dense bract stacking, rounded calyx formation, uniform canopy development, and a resin presentation that holds cosmetic appeal across a wide range of environmental tolerances. That matters operationally. When facilities run perpetual cycles or multi-room rotations with varied microclimates, cultivars that maintain consistent visual mass and color under imperfect uniformity reduce batch-to-batch variance and lower rejection risk at wholesale. Lineage families that produce confectionary fruit, candy rind, and cream-leaning top notes also tend to cure into profiles that remain recognizable even when minor drying inconsistencies occur, which protects perceived quality even when the chemistry is partially flattened. Procurement systems reinforce this preference. Many buyers develop portfolio expectations based on repeatable organoleptic cues rather than lineage or chemical architecture. When a jar opens and presents sweet-leaning, approachable aromatics with soft gas or fruit rounding, the product is pre-validated against historic sales performance. This reduces decision friction and accelerates purchasing cycles. In contrast, sulfur-forward, phenolic, resin-fermented, or mineral-sharp expressions force a sensory evaluation that does not map cleanly to existing retail narratives. Those lots require time, explanation, and a willingness to reposition consumer expectations, all of which slow down purchasing and introduce perceived risk. In fast-moving markets, risk aversion wins. Yield to labor performance further biases the system. Dessert-dominant families are often stabilized in breeding programs with an emphasis on canopy efficiency, trim uniformity, and flower density that holds weight through dry and machine-assisted processing. That makes them compatible with scaling models that depend on predictable throughput. Chemically distinctive cultivars, including sulfur-expressive lines, frequently present more fragile external resin, asymmetric bract formation, or drying curves that require slower moisture equilibration to preserve volatile integrity. When handled improperly, these lots lose their defining character and are penalized in grading. For operators without the post-harvest discipline or staffing needed to treat each cultivar as its own process profile, dessert genetics remains safer economically. COA interpretation in many buyer environments remains anchored to cannabinoid totals and broad terpene abundance rather than to the presence of trace, high-impact volatiles. Dessert-leaning cuts often pair visually impressive flower with total terpene values that track well in summary fields, even if the chemical composition is clustered in similar aromatic corridors. Sulfur-driven profiles may present lower apparent terpene totals while still delivering stronger sensory distinctiveness, but that nuance is invisible in simplified reporting contexts. As long as purchase decisions are mediated through top-line metrics rather than deeper chemical resolution, the cultivars that match those metrics will continue to dominate shelf placement. Brand positioning compounds the effect. Many marketing frameworks were built during the era when confectionary, fruit sweet, and soft gas hybrids defined modern premium. Packaging language, tasting descriptors, and consumer education materials were all written around that spectrum. Introducing cultivars that present savory fermented, rubber skunk, garlic onion, or metallic resin edges forces brands to rewrite their vocabulary and retrain staff. Without a mature internal education program, those releases are inconsistently communicated and underperform relative to safer portfolio staples. This feeds a self-confirming loop. Unfamiliar chemistry is deemed too niche, not because the market rejects it, but because the organization lacks the infrastructure to present it correctly. Finally, replacement cost and propagation inertia keep the dessert genetics in circulation. Once a facility invests in mother stock, scheduling, room recipes, and inventory forecasting around a narrow set of cultivars, swapping genetics carries real exposure. A new line must not only perform agronomically, it must integrate into an existing operational rhythm without jeopardizing cash flow. Dessert profile cultivars with long performance histories are easy to justify to finance teams and ownership structures. Chemically divergent cultivars must prove themselves across multiple runs before they are trusted at scale, and many organizations lack the R&D bandwidth to sustain that validation process. This is why dessert genetics remain dominant even as operators rebuild chemical diversity elsewhere in the industry. It is not a question of quality, and it is not a misunderstanding of what the plant can do. It is the outcome of structural forces, procurement behavior, production economics, visual grading standards, COA-mediated decision-making, post-harvest process compatibility, and organizational risk tolerance, all converging to reward cultivars that are easy to sell and hard to fail, even if they narrow the chemical landscape the industry depends on. Legal cannabis is now a major economic sector in North America and globally, with multiple market forecasts projecting sustained growth over the coming decade. In aggregate industry projections from multiple reputable market research firms, the global cannabis market size encompassing flower, extracts, and ancillary products is expected to expand from tens of billions in current valuation toward triple-digit billions by the end of the decade, indicating that consumer demand continues to broaden as legalization increases and new product categories mature. Reports show the legal market commanding a dominant share of total cannabis revenue and continuing to grow annually, with adult use segments leading the charge in the United States. These scale figures reflect an environment where commercial actors are increasingly influenced by macroeconomic imperatives rather than solely by cultural preferences. Separate research into how consumers describe cannabis products based on sensory sorting studies and usage patterns reveals that users currently interpret flower characteristics through a finite set of familiar descriptors, with categories that cluster around fruity, floral, spicy, and sweet profiles. These categories align with the dominant profiles being cultivated and marketed in regulated channels and suggest that a significant portion of the consumer base is interacting with a constrained sensory palette that reinforces the commercial prevalence of dessert-leaning profiles. Flavored cannabis use studies paint a complementary picture. A large fraction of adult cannabis users report using products with notable flavor attributes, and fruit and candy dessert are among the most commonly reported flavor experiences in inhaled products, ahead of other categories. This demonstrates that, at least in the regulated market, the flavors most encountered by users are concentrated in those familiar sweet and dessert-adjacent zones, not because that is all cannabis can do, but because that is what has been most available through legal retail pathways. When these data are layered over the structural mechanisms described previously, procurement risk aversion, production standardization, visual grading, bias, reporting frameworks that emphasize total terpenes over nuanced volatile signatures, and inventory turnover metrics tied to consumer familiarity, the persistence of dessert genetics becomes less a matter of subjective taste and more a predictable outcome of how commercial pressures shape supply. Corporations and large-scale operators are tasked with managing cash flow, reducing inventory risk, meeting investor expectations, and minimizing variability at scale. They therefore prioritize genetics that produce predictable output along traits most recognized by the majority of their customers. In economic terms, this is a bottleneck. Demand in the aggregate does not necessarily call for less common chemotypes, but corporate production systems are structured to supply the most commercially efficient chemotypes first. At the same time, the scale of the legal market and the diversity of consumer segments shown by national demand studies, with significant majorities of adults reporting familiarity with cannabis, openness to diverse consumption formats, and high interest in wellness and lifestyle applications, suggests that latent demand exists for broader expression beyond the homogenized profiles. As the industry continues to mature, that latent demand, combined with the reintroduction of sulfur-based and other underrepresented chemotypes, stands in contrast to the bottleneck effect created by consolidated corporate supply chains. In summary, real market data show that dessert-leaning cannabis profiles are pervasive in regulated channels, not because they are the only flavors cannabis can produce, but because they have been systemically favored by production, procurement, and retail dynamics driven by corporate economics. At the same time, a large and growing market base indicates that expanding sensory diversity, including sulfur-driven, savory, herbal, and terpene-rich profiles, has the potential to to find commercial traction as the industry evolves beyond its early phase of compression toward a more diversified and chemically expressive future. That brings us to where we stand today, an industry trying to balance culture, lineage integrity, and chemical diversity inside a commercial environment that rewards predictability a little more than curiosity. Everything presented here is education and analysis for operators, policy-aware consumers, and professionals working inside regulated markets. Nothing in this program is guidance to cultivate, distribute, or consume outside the laws that govern your jurisdiction, and every region has its own rules, enforcement structures, and compliance obligations. If you are participating in this space, know your laws, respect your regulators, and understand that the difference between innovation and non-compliance is not a philosophical debate. It is paperwork, licensing, and accountability. And with that said, it is hard not to smile at how cannabis keeps teaching us the same lesson in new packaging. Anytime we think we have optimized the plant, it quietly reminds us that biology does not care about brand decks, investor decks, or the flavor of the month. You can engineer a market around confectionary profiles and clean jar notes, and somewhere in a quiet R&D room, a grower is coaxing a sulfur-forward monster back into relevance just to prove that chemistry still has a sense of humor. It is the type of humor only the plant can deliver, not punchlines, just uncooperative truth. For anyone working inside this space, especially those rebuilding lost expression or protecting older lines because it matters to them, you are operating in a world where economics, regulation, and culture all pull in different directions at the same time. There is nothing inherently wrong with wanting to build a business, feed a staff, and keep the lights on. There is also nothing unserious about refusing to let the chemical range of the plant collapse just because it is easier to sell pastries than complexity. The work lives in the tension between those forces, and the people who understand that tend to build the most honest rooms. This project exists for that reason, to make the conversation transparent, to put real information on the table without hype or mythology, and to do it in a way that respects both the law and the plant. If you learn something, challenge it, test it, verify it, and hold your operators and educators to the same standard. If you are here for the culture good, you are going to need patience. If you are here for the business good, you are going to need humility. And if you are here because all the flour smells like a bakery and you are starting to suspect that might not be an accident, then you are exactly where you should be. Intel 420. Signing off, educational, compliance-aware, and still willing to admit that sometimes the funniest thing in cannabis is how serious the science becomes the minute someone opens a jar and says, "This one smells different."